At 11:45 a.m. on March 24, 1945, the sky over Berlin was broken. It was the longest mission of the war, a massive 1,600-mile round trip into the heart of the Third Reich. High above the clouds, at 26,000 feet, a stream of American B-17 flying fortresses stretched across the horizon like a slow-moving river of silver. Inside those bombers, 10,000 men were sweating in their sheepskin suits, their oxygen masks freezing to their faces, their eyes scanning the void. They were terrified. But they were not terrified of the flak. They were not terrified of the standard German fighters. They were terrified of a sound. For years, the sound of aerial warfare had been the low, guttural rumble of piston engines and propellers. It was a mechanical growl. But in the last few months of the war, a new sound had appeared. It was a high-pitched, banshee scream. It sounded like ripping canvas. It sounded like the future arriving to kill you. From the sun, they appeared. The Messerschmitt Me-262s. They did not have propellers. They had swept wings and gaping mouths under the wings that swallowed air and spit out fire. These were the world's first operational jet fighters. They were flying at 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Americans had. They cut through the bomber formation like sharks swimming through a school of tuna. The B-17 gunners could not track them. The turrets could not spin fast enough. The jets slashed in, fired their massive 30mm cannons, and were gone before the empty shell casings hit the floor of the bomber. The American escort fighters, the P-51 Mustangs, were the best piston engine planes ever built. But against the jet, they were statues. They were trying to chase a Ferrari with a tractor. The physics were broken. The Germans had rewritten the rulebook. But on this specific morning, the Germans made a mistake. They assumed that the American pilots in the P-51s would panic. They assumed the Americans would break formation. They did not know who was flying the Mustangs with the bright red tails. Inside the cockpit of a P-51 named Bunny, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown watched the jets dive. He felt the vibration of his Merlin engine, a piece of machinery that was suddenly obsolete. He knew the math was impossible. He could not catch them in a straight line. He could not outclimb them. But Roscoe Brown was not just fighting a technological war. He was fighting a war that had started 20 years before he ever sat in a cockpit. He pushed his throttle past the gate. He rolled his plane upside down. He did not run away from the monsters. He dove right into their teeth. To understand why a man would dive a propeller plane at a jet fighter, you have to understand the anger that fueled the engine. You have to go back to a stack of paper written in 1925, 20 years before the jets screamed over Berlin. The United States Army War College released a report. It was titled, "The Use of Negro Manpower in War." It was not a tactical manual. It was a hit piece. The generals and the scientists of the day had sat down and officially concluded that black men were physically and mentally incapable of flying an airplane. The report was brutal. It claimed that African Americans lacked the intelligence to operate complex machinery. It claimed they lacked the physical reflexes to control a plane in 3 dimensions. But the worst insult was about courage. The report stated, in black and white, that black men were cowardly by nature and would panic under fire. It said they lacked the discipline to fight as a unit. It essentially classified an entire race of people as useless for anything other than digging ditches or driving trucks. This was not just an opinion. It was policy. For decades, if a black man walked into a recruiting office and said he wanted to fly, the recruiter would point at the door. The door was locked. The sky was whites only. But when World War II kicked off, the pressure became too great. The NAACP, the newspapers, and Eleanor Roosevelt demanded that black men be given a chance to fight. The Army Air Corps reluctantly agreed, but they did not do it because they believed in equality. They did it because they wanted to prove the report right. They set up a segregated training program at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. They called it the experiment. The goal of the experiment was failure. They built the airfield in the middle of the Deep South, surrounded by a society that treated them like second-class citizens. They set the academic standards higher than any white squadron. They washed out cadets for the smallest infractions. They waited for the men to quit. They waited for them to crash. But they did not crash. They thrived. Men like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., a West Point graduate who had spent 4 years at the academy being shunned by his white classmates, literally 4 years of silence, took command. He was not just a pilot. He was a man made of iron discipline. He told his men that they could not just be good. They had to be perfect. If a white pilot made a mistake, well, it was just a mistake. If a Tuskegee Airman made a mistake, well, it was proof that the 1925 report was right. They were flying with the weight of their entire race in the cockpit. They graduated. They earned their silver wings. But the Army still did not want to use them. While white pilots were being rushed to England to fight the Luftwaffe, the Tuskegee Airmen were sent to North Africa and Italy to fly outdated planes on patrol missions miles away from the action. They were given the P-40 Warhawk, a rugged but slow plane that was already obsolete. They were told to strafe trucks and shoot at trains. It was dangerous work, but it was not the air war. It was the scraps. The white commanders mocked them. They called them the Spade Squadron. They filed reports saying the 99th Fighter Squadron lacked aggressive spirit. They tried to disband the unit in 1943. They wanted to send them home and say, "We told you so." But then, the bomber offensive started to bleed. By 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces were losing bombers at a catastrophic rate. The German Luftwaffe was slaughtering the B-17s and B-24s. The white fighter groups were aggressive. Yes, they were hunting for kills. They would leave the bombers to chase German fighters, looking for glory, leaving the big friends unprotected. The bomber crews were dying by the thousands. The generals needed a shield. They were desperate enough to use anyone. They gave the Tuskegee Airmen a new plane, the P-51 Mustang, and they gave them a new job, escort. The P-51 was a revelation. It was the Cadillac of the skies. It was sleek, fast, and carried enough fuel to fly deep into Germany. But before they flew their first mission, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis gathered his men. He looked them in the eye. He gave them an order that went against every instinct of a fighter pilot. He said, "Your job is not to shoot down German planes. Your job is to bring the bombers home." He laid down the law. If a German fighter attacked, you fought him off, but you did not chase him. You stayed with the bombers. You were the shield, not the spear. If you left the bombers to chase a kill, you would be court-martialed. To the hotshot pilots, this sounded like a leash, but to the bomber crews, it sounded like a prayer answered. They painted the tails of their Mustangs a bright blood red. It was a badge of identification. When the 332nd Fighter Group showed up over the rendezvous point, the bomber crews looked out their windows. They did not see black men. They did not see the politics of 1925. They saw the red tails. And they saw something they had never seen before. They saw fighters that stayed. When the Luftwaffe attacked, the red tails would dive in, break up the attack, and then, miraculously, they would pull up and slot back into position right next to the bombers. They stuck to the heavy planes like glue. They took hits meant for the B-17s. The reputation grew. The bomber crews started asking for them. "We want the red tails," they'd say in the briefing rooms. They called them the red-tailed angels. The myth began to spread that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a single bomber under their protection. That was not statistically true. In the chaos of war, perfection is impossible, but it was spiritually true. They brought more men home than anyone else. But by March 1945, the game had changed. The Luftwaffe was dying, but in its death throes, it had birthed the monster. The propeller era was ending. The jet era had begun. The Me-262 was Hitler's last gamble. It was a weapon that ignored the laws of aerodynamics as the Allies knew them. It climbed faster, dove faster, and hit harder than anything in the sky. The Allied intelligence officers were terrified. They warned the pilots that the jet was untouchable. They said you could not dogfight it. So here we are, March 24th, 1945. The Red Tails are escorting a massive raid to the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin. They are flying the best piston engine fighter in the world. But they are about to face a machine that does not have pistons. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, a former college student who had been told by his government that he was not smart enough to fly, is cruising at 25,000 feet. He checks his SIGs. He checks the bombers. And then he sees the contrails. They are not normal contrails. They are thick, dark, and expanding rapidly. And they are moving way too fast. The radio crackles. Bogies, 12 o'clock high. Coming down fast. The jets are here. And they are not here to play. They are screaming down in a vertical dive, aiming straight for the B-17s. The speed is terrifying. To a pilot used to 300 miles per hour, 550 looks like teleportation. Roscoe Brown has a split second to make a decision. The manual says to turn into the attack, but if he turns, the jet will just zoom past him. The jet is too fast to catch from behind. If he tries to run, he dies. He realizes there is only one way to kill a jet. You have to anticipate where it's going to be. You have to meet it. Brown kicks his rudder. He rolls his Mustang onto its back. He pulls the stick into his gut. The G-forces slam him into the seat. The blood drains from his head. He enters a screaming power dive, his engine whining in protest. He is trying to intercept the jet at the bottom of its dive, right as it pulls out to attack the bombers. He is playing a game of 3D geometry at 500 miles per hour. If he misses, the jet will shred the bombers. If he hits, he becomes a legend. If he crashes, he's just another statistic in a report that said he could not fly. The two planes are closing at a combined speed of nearly 1,000 miles per hour. The propeller against the turbine. The past against the future. The underdog against the superweapon. Roscoe Brown puts the floating yellow diamond of his gun sight on the shark-like nose of the German jet. He holds his breath. The experiment is about to meet the master race, and only one of them is going home. Before we watch Roscoe Brown pull the trigger, we have to freeze that frame. We have to pause the film at 20,000 feet and look at the monster diving through the clouds. Because to understand the courage it took to engage that machine, you have to understand what it was. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was not just another airplane. It was a glitch in the Matrix. In a world where aviation was defined by the throb of pistons and the spin of propellers, the 262 was an alien spacecraft. It did not burn high-octane gasoline. It burned J2 diesel fuel, a heavy, oily kerosene that smelled like a burning lamp factory. It did not have a propeller clawing the air. It had two Junkers Umo 004 turbojets slung under the wings. These engines sucked in air, compressed it, set it on fire, and blasted it out the back. The result was speed that broke the minds of Allied pilots. A P-51 Mustang, pushing its engine to the point of exploding, could hit 440 miles per hour in level flight. The Me-262 cruised at 540. It could climb at speeds that made the Mustang look like it was parked. But the speed was not the scariest part. The scariest part was the teeth. Standard German fighters carried machine guns and maybe a 20mm cannon. The jet carried four Mark 108 30mm cannons in the nose. These were not machine guns. They were grenade launchers. They fired Minengeschoss, mine shells. These were thin-walled steel casings packed with high explosives. They did not punch holes. They detonated on contact. One single hit from a 30mm shell could blow the wing off a B-17. 4 hits would vaporize the fuselage. The jet was a bomber killer designed by engineers who knew the war was lost unless they could invent a miracle. And the pilots flying them? They were not rookies. They were the Experten, the German aces. Men like Adolf Galland, who had survived the entire war. The Luftwaffe had gathered their surviving elite, put them in these futuristic machines, and told them to save the Reich. They called themselves the Knights of the Air. They looked down on the American piston fighters as relics. They believed they were invincible because, according to the laws of physics, they were. Now, look at the man diving to meet them. Roscoe Brown was not supposed to be there. In fact, if the U.S. Army had its way, he would not even be an officer. He would be mopping a floor or driving a supply truck in Mississippi. The road that led Brown to the cockpit of a P-51 was not paved with glory. It was paved with humiliation. The Tuskegee program began as a PR stunt. The War Department was tired of the black press complaining about exclusion, so they set up a flight school in Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the heart of the segregated South. They designed it to fail. They assumed that black cadets would wash out, crash planes, and prove the scientific theories of white supremacy correct. The training was brutal. The cadets were the cream of the crop, college graduates, athletes, mathematicians, but they were treated like children. They could not use the officers' club. They could not walk on certain sidewalks. They were trained by white instructors who often refused to return their salutes. They were subjected to psychological hazing. Instructors would fail them for having a smudge on their boots or for looking at a superior officer the wrong way. The washout rate was artificially high. They were looking for any excuse to send these men home. But the cadets refused to break. They formed a brotherhood of steel. They tutored each other at night. They marched with perfect precision. They flew the wings off their training planes. They knew that they were not just learning to fly. They were carrying the dignity of 12 million people on their shoulders. When the first class graduated and the 99th Fighter Squadron was formed, the Army did not know what to do with them. They did not trust them with the shiny new P-51s or P-47s. They gave them the P-40 Warhawk. The P-40 was a tough plane, but by 1943, it was a dinosaur. It was heavy, slow, and struggled at high altitudes. Against a German Me-109, it was a sitting duck. So the Army sent the Tuskegee Airmen to North Africa and told them to stay out of the way. They were assigned to coastal patrol. While the white squadrons were dogfighting over the front lines, the 99th was flying back and forth over empty ocean, waiting for an enemy that never came. They called it the Jim Crow Air Force. But eventually, the war found them. During the invasion of Sicily and Italy, the 99th was finally thrown into the fight. They were told to provide close air support. This meant flying the heavy P-40 down in the mud, strafing German trucks and artillery positions. It was dirty and dangerous work. The German flak was thick. Small arms fire punched holes in their floorboards. They learned to fly aggressive. They learned to fly low. And they learned to fight. On their first encounter with German fighters, they did not panic as the 1925 report predicted. They fought back. Lieutenant Charles Hall shot down a Focke-Wulf 190, proving that the cowardly nature theory was garbage. But the brass did not care. Colonel William Momeyer, the commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, despised the black pilots. He filed an official memorandum to the Pentagon recommending that the 99th be removed from combat. He claimed they had no desire to fight. He cherry-picked statistics to make them look bad. He tried to kill the experiment with a fountain pen. He almost succeeded. The War Department summoned Benjamin O. Davis Jr. to Washington to defend his men. Davis stood before a committee of skeptical white generals and laid out the facts. He showed them that his men had flown more sorties per pilot than the white squadrons. He showed them that they were flying obsolete planes on suicide missions without complaint. He saved the unit by the skin of his teeth. But the real turning point was not in a committee room. it was in the sky over Germany. The bomber losses were unsustainable. The 15th Air Force was bleeding to death. They did not care about the color of a pilot's skin anymore. They cared about survival. In 1944, the order came down. The Tuskegee Airmen, now expanded into the 332nd Fighter Group, were upgrading. They were trading their clunky P-40s for the P-51 Mustang. When the pilots first saw the Mustangs, they fell in love. It was like trading a dump truck for a Ferrari. The P-51 had range. It had power. It had the Merlin engine that screamed at high altitude. To mark their new status, the mechanics painted the tails of the aircraft a distinct, bright red. But with the new plane came a new doctrine. Colonel Davis gathered the men in Italy. He was a stern man, a man who rarely smiled. He knew that the white fighter groups were glory hunting. They would escort the bombers halfway to the target, see a German fighter formation, and break off to chase kills. They wanted to become aces. They wanted the medals. Meanwhile, the German fighters would loop around and butcher the defenseless bombers. Davis drew a line in the sand. "We do not chase," he told them. "We stay." It was a hard order to swallow. Fighter pilots are hunters by nature. They want to shoot things down. Davis was telling them to be sheepdogs. He told them that if he saw a red tail chasing a German plane away from the formation, that pilot would be grounded forever. "Our trophy is the bomber," he said. "If the bomber comes home, we win." This discipline transformed them. They developed a unique formation. They wove around the bomber stream in a protective cocoon. When the Luftwaffe attacked, the red tails would turn into them, fire a burst to break up the attack, and then, instead of pursuing the fleeing German, they would execute a sharp Immelmann turn and snap back to the bomber's wing. To the German pilots, it was frustrating. They could not lure the Americans away. To the American bomber crews, it was a miracle. They would look out the window and see that red tail sitting right there, steady as a rock. They started calling them the Red Tail Angels. The racial slurs evaporated in the face of gratitude. When you are 5 miles high and freezing to death, you do not care if the man saving your life is black, white, or purple. You just care that he can shoot. So, when Roscoe Brown rolled his Mustang over Berlin on that March morning, he was not just a pilot. He was the product of a crucible. He had survived the racism of Alabama. He had survived the boredom of North Africa. He had survived the slander of his own commanders. He had been forged into a weapon of pure discipline. But discipline alone does not kill a jet. The Me-262s were diving. They were moving so fast that they covered a mile every 6 seconds. Roscoe Brown was in a power dive, his airspeed indicator shaking past 450. The airframe of the Mustang was groaning, the metal skin rippling under the stress. He was not chasing the jet. You cannot chase a jet. He was leading it. He was predicting where it would be. The German pilot in the lead jet was confident. He was flying the ultimate weapon. He saw the B-17s ahead. He checked his sights. He prepared to unleash his 30mm mine shells. He did not see the red tail diving from above. He did not check his blind spot because he believed he was too fast to have a blind spot. Brown pulled out of his dive. The G-forces crushed him. His vision grayed out for a second, and when his eyes cleared, the jet was right there. It was streaking across his nose, a silver blur of kerosene fumes and arrogance. This was not a dogfight. It was a deflection shot. Brown had a fraction of a second. He did not aim at the jet. He aimed at the empty air in front of it. He pressed the trigger. 6, 4. 50 caliber machine guns roared. The tracers reached out like fingers. The German pilot never knew what hit him. Brown's bullets did not just hit the jet. They walked right into the engine intake. The Jumo 004 engine was a delicate piece of machinery. It spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. When it ingested the heavy 50 caliber rounds, it shattered. The turbine blades disintegrated. The engine exploded. The jet slewed violently to the right. The wing tore off. The invincible weapon of the future tumbled out of the sky, trailing a long plume of black smoke. Brown did not celebrate. He did not do a victory roll. He remembered Colonel Davis's order. He pulled his stick back, climbed hard, and went back to the bombers. But the radio chatter was insane. "Splash one jet! Splash one!" The bomber crews were screaming. They had just seen the impossible. A propeller plane had slapped a jet out of the sky. The psychological barrier was broken. The monster could be killed, and the Red Tails were just getting started. That day, over the skies of Berlin, the experiment proved that it was not an experiment at all. It was the elite. The jets were faster, yes, but the men in the cockpits of the Mustangs were hungrier. They had fought harder to get there. And they were not going to let a little thing like the laws of physics stop them from protecting their flock. But the fight over Berlin was just one moment. The legacy of the Red Tails was not built on a single kill. It was built on the grind. It was built on the missions that did not make the headlines. And as the war in Europe ground to a halt, the Tuskegee Airmen would face one final enemy. An enemy that did not fly jets, but flew something far more sinister. They were about to come home. And home was a battlefield they could not shoot their way out of. This was not just a lucky shot. Roscoe Brown's victory over the jet was not a fluke. It was a statement. On that same day, over the burning skyline of Berlin, two other Tuskegee Airmen, Lieutenant Earl Lane and Flight Officer Charles Winslow, also scored kills against the Me-262s. They cracked the code. They proved that the German superweapon had a fatal flaw. The pilot inside it was human, and he could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and outgunned by men who had been told they were not smart enough to fly crop dusters. But the Red Tails were not satisfied with just killing jets. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, the mission profile changed. The Luftwaffe was hiding. The sky was empty. So, the hunters looked down. Strafing is the most dangerous job in the Air Force. In a dogfight, you were fighting one man. In a strafing run, you were fighting every single soldier on the ground who has a rifle, a machine gun, or a rock to throw. You were flying at 400 miles per hour at treetop level. If you hit a telephone pole, you die. If you fly through the debris of the truck you just blew up, you die. If your engine takes one lucky bullet from a terrified teenager with a Mauser, you die. The 332nd became masters of the ground attack. They turned the P-51 Mustang, a thoroughbred racehorse designed for high-altitude escort, into a mud-caked street fighter. They hunted trains. This was a specialty. A steam locomotive is a massive, pressurized bomb. If you hit the boiler with a .50 caliber incendiary round, it does not just stop, it detonates. There are reports of red-tail pilots flying so low and hitting trains so hard that they flew through the steam explosion. They would land back at base in Ramitelli, Italy, with their windshields coated in oil and coal dust, pieces of German steel embedded in their aluminum wings. But their most insane feat did not happen against a jet or a train. It happened against a ship. Historically, fighter planes do not sink destroyers. It's a matter of physics. A destroyer is a steel mountain loaded with anti-aircraft guns. A P-51 is a delicate aluminum kite. If a fighter wants to sink a ship, it usually carries a bomb or a torpedo. The Red Tails did not have bombs that day. They just had their 6 machine guns, and a complete lack of respect for the laws of naval warfare. The target was a German destroyer in the harbor of Trieste, Italy. It was a TA-class torpedo boat, a nasty piece of work that had been harassing Allied shipping. The Red Tails spotted it. They did not call for bombers. They did not turn away. They formed a line and initiated a strafe in. Imagine the scene from the deck of that German ship. You see a swarm of Mustangs diving at you. You expect them to peel off. Instead, they opened fire. Thousands of .50 caliber rounds hammered the ship. They did not aim for the hull. They aimed for the weak points. They shredded the bridge, killing the officers. They punched holes in the steam pipes. They ignited the ammunition on the deck. The P-51 circled like sharks, taking turns making runs. They pounded the steel warship until it literally stopped moving. Then, something happened that should not have been possible. The destroyer caught fire, exploded, and sank. They had sunk a naval vessel with machine guns. It was an act of surgical violence. It proved that there was nothing, not a jet, not a train, not a warship, that the Spade Squadron could not destroy. But while they were winning the war in Europe, a different kind of war was brewing back home. And this war did not have a clear enemy you could shoot at. The irony of the Tuskegee Airmen is bitter. They were fighting to destroy a racist, genocidal regime in Germany, while serving a country that treated them like a virus. In the air, over Berlin, they were gods. They were the red-tailed angels. White bomber crews would wave at them. Generals would praise them. But the moment the wheels of their Mustangs touched the tarmac in Italy, the magic spell broke. They climbed out of the cockpit and became Negroes again. They returned to segregated bases. They were not allowed to enter the same towns as the white officers. They had to sit in the back of the transport trucks. There were instances where German prisoners of war, literal Nazis who had been shooting at Americans hours earlier, were allowed to eat in the whites-only mess halls, while the Tuskegee Airmen who captured them were forced to eat outside in the dirt. Think about that rage. You just saved a B-17 crew from a jet fighter. You land, and you watch a Nazi officer eating a steak in a dining room you are not allowed to enter. This tension exploded not in Europe, but in Indiana. It is an event known as the Freeman Field Mutiny, and it is one of the most important battles of World War II, even though not a single shot was fired. While the Red Tails were fighting in Italy, a second group of Black Airmen was being trained in the U.S. This was the 477th Bombardment Group. They flew B-25 Mitchell bombers. They were officers, lieutenants, and captains, intelligent, educated, and fierce. They were stationed at Freeman Field in Indiana. The base commander, Colonel Robert Selway, was a staunch segregationist. He set up two officers' clubs. One was Club Number 1, which was luxurious, stocked with liquor, pool tables, and fireplaces. This was designated for trainees, which coincidentally meant all the white officers. The second was Club Number 2, which was a rundown shack with no amenities. This was for instructors, which coincidentally meant all the black officers. It was a transparent lie to enforce segregation against Army regulations. The black officers, led by men like Coleman Young, who would later become the first black mayor of Detroit, decided they had had enough. They were not going to fight Hitler abroad and accept Jim Crow at home. They planned a tactical assault. Not on a German bunker, but on the officers' club. On the night of April 5th, 1945, just weeks after Roscoe Brown shot down that jet, groups of black officers marched to Club Number 1. They walked past the MPs. They ignored the orders to stop. They pushed past the provost marshal. They walked into the White Club and ordered a drink. It sounds small, but in 1945, this was a revolution. The reaction was immediate. The base went into lockdown. The alarms sounded. It was not an air raid. It was a race riot prevention measure. The colonel ordered them to leave. They refused. Over the next few days, 61 officers were arrested. Then more. Colonel Selway tried to trap them. He drafted a new regulation, Base Regulation 85-2, which officially codified the segregation of the clubs. He ordered every black officer to sign it. It was a loyalty test. If you signed, you accepted your inferiority. If you refused, you were disobeying a direct order in wartime, a crime punishable by death. 101 officers refused to sign. They were arrested. They were locked in a stockade. They were threatened with execution for mutiny, but they did not blink. They stood in their cells, in their uniforms, with their pilot wings on their chests, and stared down the United States Army. This was the Double V campaign in action. Victory abroad, victory at home. They knew that if they backed down now, the Red Tail's sacrifices in Europe meant nothing. They were fighting for the soul of the country. The news reached Washington. It reached the press. The optics were a disaster. Here was the Army, preparing to court-martial 101 of its best pilots for wanting to have a beer in a club, while simultaneously bragging about the Red Tails shooting down jets in Berlin. The hypocrisy was too loud to ignore. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, stepped in. He ordered the men released. He ordered the 477th to be moved. It was not a total victory. The segregation did not end overnight, but it was the first crack in the dam. The Freeman Field Mutiny planted the seed that would eventually lead to President Harry Truman signing Executive Order 9981 3 years later, desegregating the entire U.S. military. The Red Tails did not just defeat the Luftwaffe with their Mustangs. They defeated the logic of racism with their excellence. Back in Europe, the war was ending. The Red Tails flew their final missions. They escorted intelligence planes. They strafed retreating German columns. When the news came on May 8, 1945, V-Day, the airfield at Ramitelli erupted. The pilots fired their guns in the air. They drank cheap Italian wine. They cried. They had done the impossible. They had flown 1,578 missions. They had destroyed 260 enemy aircraft. They had damaged a destroyer. They had earned 96 distinguished flying crosses. But the most important number was the one that did not exist in the official records: the number of bomber crews who bought them drinks. There is a legendary story, perhaps apocryphal, but it speaks to the truth of the moment. A B-17 pilot, a white boy from Georgia who had grown up in the Klan country, met a Tuskegee Airman at a bar in Italy after the surrender. The white pilot looked at the black pilot. A few years ago, he would not have shaken his hand. He might have crossed the street to avoid him. But on this night, the white pilot took off his flight wings. He put them on the bar. He said, "I saw that red tail today. I saw you dive on those 109s. You saved my ass. You can drink on my tab for the rest of your life." It was a small moment, but it was the beginning of the end of the old world. The Red Tails packed up their Mustangs. They painted over the nose art. They boarded the transport ships. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty. They were heroes. But America was not ready for them yet. When Roscoe Brown, the man who killed a jet, applied for a job as a commercial airline pilot, he was laughed out of the office. "We do not hire Negroes," the airline said. Passengers would not feel safe. He had defeated the ME-262. He had defeated the Luftwaffe's aces, but he could not defeat the hiring manager at Pan Am. This is the tragedy of the story. But it is not the end of the story, because the Tuskegee Airmen did not stop fighting when they took off the uniform. They took that same discipline, that red tail discipline, and they applied it to the civil rights movement. They became lawyers. They became doctors. They became politicians. They realized that the fight for America was not over. It had just moved from the sky to the courtroom. Roscoe Brown did not fly airliners. He got a PhD. He became a professor. He taught thousands of young minds that excellence is the best rebellion. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the first black general in the Air Force. They played the long game. They knew that history would eventually catch up to the truth. And they were right. Today, if you go to an air show and you see a P-51 Mustang with a red tail, the crowd goes silent. It is not just a cool paint job. It is a symbol. It stands for the idea that talent has no color. It stands for the idea that if you give a man a chance and a good plane, he can touch the sky. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that the experiment was a success. The failure was not in the black pilots. The failure was in the system that doubted them. And on that day over Berlin, when the piston engine defeated the jet, they did not just win a dogfight. They won the argument. We tell this story to ensure that the roar of the Red Tails never fades. We tell it because the battles they fought on the ground were just as hard as the ones they fought in the air. And we tell it because in the end, they were simply the best. If this story of the red-tailed angels inspired you, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that real heroism matters. Check your subscription. Are you locked in? We're digging up the history they did not teach you in school. And I want to hear from you. Drop your city and state in the comments. Let's see where the Patriots are watching from today. Let's build a map of people who remember. Would you have had the discipline to stay with the bombers while the jets were attacking? Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep flying. Before the jets over Berlin, and before the glory, there was the grind. And the grind had a name, Ploesti. If you ask any bomber pilot who flew in the European theater what word keeps them awake at night, they won't not say Berlin. They will not say Hamburg. They will say Ploesti. This was the oil capital of Romania. It was the gas station of the Nazi war machine. It supplied 1/3 of all the fuel used by Hitler's tanks and planes. Because it was so vital, the Germans did not just defend it. They turned it into a volcano. The flak over Ploesti was so thick that pilots swore you could get out and walk on the explosions. The smoke from the refineries rose to 10,000 feet, a black, oily pillar of death that hid balloons, cables, and fighters. Sending bombers into Ploesti was considered a death sentence. The 15th Air Force had lost hundreds of planes trying to shut off the tap. But in the summer of 1944, the orders came down again. We are going back. And this time, the Red Tails are taking point. This was the ultimate test of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr.'s discipline. Remember his rule? We do not chase, we stay. Over Ploesti, that rule was torture. Imagine sitting in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang. You are at 24,000 feet. Below you, the bombers are flying into a wall of black smoke. You see the German fighters, Me-109s and FW-190s, hovering above, waiting to dive. They are the wolves. You are the sheepdog. The instinct of every fighter pilot is to climb up and kill the wolves before they attack. But Davis said no. If you chase them, then you leave the flock exposed. So the Tuskegee Airmen had to sit there. They had to fly straight and level, weaving around the slow bombers, while 88mm flak shells burst all around them. They had to be human shields. There is a story from a bomber pilot named Robert Williams. He was flying a B-24 Liberator, a lumbering giant that was currently leaking fuel and limping on 3 engines. He had fallen behind the formation. This is the coffin corner. A straggler is easy meat for the Luftwaffe. Williams saw 2 dots approaching from 6 o'clock high. He keyed his mic to tell his crew to bail out. He thought it was the end. But as the dots got closer, he saw the color. Bright, blood-red tails. It was 2 Tuskegee Airmen. They did not just fly by. They slowed down. They dropped their flaps to reduce their speed to match the crippled bomber, a dangerous maneuver that made them sitting ducks for anti-aircraft fire. One Mustang slid onto his left wing, the other onto his right. They were so close Williams could see the pilots' faces. They escorted him for 200 miles, through enemy airspace, nursing him all the way back to the Adriatic Sea. When Williams landed, he went looking for the pilots. He expected to buy a beer for some white guys from Ohio. When he found the 332nd, he was shocked. But that shock turned into a lifelong reverence. He famously said, "I do not care what color they are. They fly like angels." But the Red Tails were not just defensive. When the bombers were safe and the orders changed, they showed the Germans that discipline did not mean passive. In Operation Strangle, the goal was to cut off the German supply lines in Italy. The targets were not in the sky. They were on the ground. And strafing is a brutal, dirty business. The P-51 Mustang is a liquid-cooled aircraft. It has a radiator under the belly. One bullet from a German rifleman hiding in a bush can pierce that radiator, drain the coolant, and seize the engine in minutes. Ground attack in a Mustang is like bringing a racehorse to a knife fight. But the 332nd adapted. They developed a level of aggression that terrified the German ground troops. They did not just strafe, they rampaged. Their favorite target was the German radar network in southern France. These radar stations were the eyes of the Luftwaffe. They were heavily defended by quad 20mm cannons. Attacking them meant flying directly into the teeth of the guns. Lieutenant Woodrow Crockett, one of the aces of the group, described it as flying into a garden hose of fire. You could see the tracer balls floating toward you, slow at first, then whipping past your canopy at the speed of sound. On August 12, 1944, the Red Tails pulled off one of the most audacious raids of the war. The target was a radar station near Toulon. Instead of bombing it from high altitude, they went in on the deck. They used the terrain to mask their approach, popping up over the hills at 400 miles per hour. They caught the Germans having lunch. The Red Tails hit the radar dishes with everything they had. They did not just disable the station, they raced it. But they did not stop there. On the way home, they spotted a German airfield. It was packed with Ju-52 transport planes and Heinkel bombers sitting on the tarmac. Now, the stay with the bomber rule did not apply. The bombers were gone. The leash was off. The Red Tails turned the airfield into a scrapyard. In a single afternoon, they destroyed or damaged over 30 German aircraft on the ground. It was a turkey shoot. They were destroying the Luftwaffe not just in the air, but in its bed. This relentless pressure had a psychological effect on the enemy. We found diaries of German soldiers captured in Italy. They wrote about the red-tailed devils. They knew that these pilots were different. They flew closer. They stayed longer. They seemed to take the war personally. And they should have taken it personally. Because every German plane they destroyed, every radar station they blinded, was a step closer to proving the lie of 1925. But there was one mission that stands out above the rest. It was not the biggest, but it was the most symbolic. It happened over the Mediterranean. A flight of Red Tails was returning from a mission when they spotted a Royal Navy destroyer under attack. A German Ju-88 bomber was lining up for a torpedo run. The British ship was firing everything it had, but the bomber was low and fast. The Red Tails dove, but they did not shoot the bomber down immediately. The lead pilot, Captain Luke Weathers, realized that if he shot the bomber from behind, the torpedo might still drop and hit the ship. So he did something insane. He flew under the bomber. He positioned his Mustang between the German plane and the water, forcing the German pilot to pull up to avoid a collision. By spoiling the run, he saved the ship. Then, as the German pilot tried to regain control, Weathers pulled up, looped over, and shot him down. The British sailors watched this acrobatic display with their mouths open. They signaled a "thank you" with their searchlight. They did not know who was in the cockpit. They just knew they had witnessed a level of airmanship that bordered on wizardry. This middle chapter of the war, the grind of Ploesti, the strafing of the radar sites, the saving of the ships, is crucial. This is where the steel was tempered. If they had not survived the flak over Romania, they never would have made it to Berlin to fight the Jets. They built a bank account of respect, coin by coin, mission by mission. And they did it all while living in tents that leaked, eating food that was often spoiled, and dealing with a supply chain that often, accidentally, lost their equipment because some quartermaster did not want to send spare parts to a black unit. They fought the enemy with bullets, and their own side with patience. And as 1945 approached, they were about to face the final boss. The propeller age was ending, the jet age was dawning, and the pilots who had mastered the art of staying were about to learn the art of chasing the fastest thing on wings. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a cornered animal. And like any cornered animal, it was most dangerous right before it died. The German armies were collapsing on the ground, but in the air, the Luftwaffe was staging a terrifying final act. They had gathered their remaining aces, the Experten, men with hundreds of kills to their names, and put them into the cockpits of the Messerschmitt Me-262. This was not just a fighter squadron. It was an all-star team of killers, flying technology that looked like it had fallen through a wormhole from the future. Their mission was simple: ignore the fighters, destroy the bombers, and stop the American industrial machine from flattening what was left of Germany. On March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force launched the longest escort mission in its history. The target was the massive Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin. It was a 1,600-mile round trip from the dusty airfields of Italy to the burning capital of the Reich. The bomber commanders did not pick names out of a hat for the escort duty. They looked at the roster. They looked at the loss rates. And they specifically requested the 332nd Fighter Group. They wanted the Red Tails. They knew that when the jets showed up, the white squadrons might chase the glory, but the black pilots would hold the line. The flight to Berlin was a marathon of endurance. Sitting in a cramped cockpit for 6 hours, vibrating at 30,000 feet, breathing frozen oxygen, is physically exhausting. But as the formation crossed the Alps and entered German airspace, the fatigue vanished. The radar stations went wild. Bandits! 12 o'clock high. It was Jagdgeschwader 7, the first operational jet fighter wing in history. They swarmed out of the clouds like angry hornets. There were over 30 of them. To understand the nightmare of fighting an Me-262 in a propeller plane, you have to understand the closing speed. A P-51 Mustang cruises at about 350 miles per hour. The Me-262 attacks at over 550 miles per hour. That means the enemy is closing the gap at nearly 1,000 feet per second. You do not see them as planes. You see them as blurs. You do not aim at them. You aim at the empty air where you hope they will be. The German jets used roller coaster tactics. They would dive from high altitude, build up massive speed, slash through the bomber formation firing their 30mm cannons, and then zoom climb back up into the sun where the Mustangs could not follow. It was hit and run on a supersonic scale. But the Germans made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the Mustangs would freeze. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was leading the group that day. He saw the contrails of the jets. He did not order a retreat. He ordered a counterattack. We've talked about Roscoe Brown's kill, but he was not alone. The sky over Berlin turned into a swirling, chaotic brawl between the past and the future. Lieutenant Earl Lane saw a jet tear through the formation. The German pilot, confident in his speed, pulled up into a steep climb, expecting to leave the Americans in the dust. Lane did not try to climb with him. He knew his Mustang would stall. Instead, he used the zoom. He pushed his throttle to emergency power, war emergency power, injecting water methanol into the cylinders. The Mustang screamed. Lane pulled the nose up, trading all his kinetic energy for altitude. He hung on the prop. For a split second, he had the shot. He sprayed the belly of the jet with 50 caliber rounds. The German plane smoked, rolled over, and disintegrated. Lane had just killed a spaceship with a tractor. Flight Officer Charles Winslow saw another jet attacking a damaged B-17. The German pilot slowed down to line up his shot, a rookie mistake. Speed was his only armor. By slowing down, he entered the Mustang's kill zone. Winslow dove. He did not just fire, he poured a stream of incendiary lead into the jet's left turbine. The engine exploded. The jet cartwheeled across the sky. And by the end of the day, the Tuskegee Airmen had shot down 3 of the Wunderwaffen. It does not sound like a lot, but psychologically, it was a nuclear bomb. The Luftwaffe had put their best men and their best machines, and they had been beaten by the inferior pilots from Alabama. The Red Tails had pierced the armor of the jet age. But the 332nd was not done making history. They had conquered the air, so they decided to conquer the sea. In the annals of World War II, fighter planes do not sink destroyers. It is a matter of physics and firepower. A destroyer is a 2,000-ton steel fortress. It has thick hull plating. It has watertight compartments. It has dozens of anti-aircraft guns. A P-51 Mustang is a delicate aluminum bird armed with machine guns that are designed to shoot down other fragile aluminum birds. If you fly a Mustang against a destroyer, the expected result is a dead pilot in a scratched ship. But nobody told Lieutenant Gwyn Pearson that. On a mission over the harbor of Trieste, Italy, a flight of redtails spotted the German destroyer TA-22. This was not a supply barge. This was a torpedo boot Ausland, a converted Italian destroyer, heavily armed and looking for a fight. Most pilots would have radioed the position and flown home. Pearson and his wingman, Captain Wendell Pruitt, decided to engage. They did not have bombs. They did not have rockets. They just had 50 caliber machine guns. To sink a ship with machine guns, you can't not just shoot the hull. The bullets will bounce off. You have to perform surgery at 400 miles per hour. You have to dissect the ship. Pearson led the attack. He dove into a wall of flak. The destroyer's guns were tracking him, filling the air with black puffs of death. Pearson held his nerve. He aimed not at the waterline, but at the superstructure. He raked the bridge, killing the officers and smashing the steering controls. Then he walked his fire down to the deck. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round is a nasty piece of work. When thousands of them hit a steel deck, they create sparks. If those sparks find fuel, or ammunition, or hydraulic fluid, Pearson and Pruitt strafed the ship repeatedly. They turned the destroyer into a colander. They ignited the ammunition lockers on the deck. They ruptured the steam pipes. The ship began to burn. The fire spread below decks. The boilers, under immense pressure and now unmanned, detonated. The TA-22 did not just sink, it was gutted. It settled into the harbor mud, a burning wreck, destroyed by two men who were not supposed to be smart enough to fly. It was the only instance in World War II where a destroyer was sunk solely by machine gun fire from fighter aircraft. It was a feat of marksmanship and aggression that should have been on the front page of every newspaper in America, but it was not. And here lies the bitter irony that defines the Tuskegee story. While they were achieving the impossible in Europe, shooting down jets, sinking ships, never losing a bomber to enemy fighters, a record that stood for decades before historians corrected it to very few bombers lost, which is still a miracle. The propaganda machine back home was silent. The Army did not want to publicize their victories. The newsreels focused on the white aces. The Redtails were winning the war, but they were invisible. When the war in Europe finally ended on May 8, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group was at its peak. They were the most experienced, the most disciplined, and most lethal escort group in the Mediterranean theater. They had flown over 15,000 sorties. They had destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft. They had earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. They gathered at their base in Ramitelli. They watched the sun go down over the Adriatic. They fired their guns into the air in celebration. They thought they had proven their point. They thought they had paid the blood tax for equality. They thought they were coming home as heroes. They were wrong. The trip home was a cold splash of reality. As the transport ships docked in New York and Boston, the white troops were greeted with ticker tape parades. Bands played. Girls ran up to kiss them. The Tuskegee Airmen were marched down the gangplank and quietly separated. White troops to the left, colored troops to the right. They were put on trains to separation centers. On those trains, German prisoners of war, literal Nazis who had fought for Hitler, were sometimes given seats in the main cars, while the Red Tail officers, men with medals on their chests, were forced to stand in the Jim Crow section. Imagine the psychological violence of that moment. You have just spent 2 years killing Nazis to save democracy. You have watched your friends die in burning planes. You have sunk destroyers. And now, You are standing in a crowded, hot train car, watching a Nazi soldier eat a sandwich in a comfortable seat because his skin is white. It was enough to break a man. It was enough to make you hate the country you just fought for. But the Red Tails did not break. The discipline that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. had drilled into them did not stop when the engines turned off. They realized that the war in the sky was over, but the war on the ground was just beginning. They did not start a riot. They started a movement. Men like Daniel Chappie James, who would go on to become a 4-star general. Men like Coleman Young, who became the mayor of Detroit. Men like Percy Sutton, who became the Manhattan Borough president. They took the confidence they had earned at 30,000 feet and brought it to the streets. They knew something the racists did not. They knew they were excellent. You can call a man a slur. You can make him sit in the back of the bus. But you cannot take away the fact that he knows, in his heart, that he outflew the master race. That confidence became the bedrock of the civil rights movement. When the legal battle started in the 1950s, the Tuskegee Airmen were there. When the marches started in the 1960s, they were there. They were the quiet warriors who knew that if you could beat a ME 262, you could beat a Jim Crow law. But there is one final chapter to this story. A moment of vindication that came decades too late, but echoed louder than a jet engine. In 1949, the U.S. Air Force held its first ever Top Gun style competition. It was called the Fighter Gunnery Meet, held in Las Vegas. Every fighter group in the Air Force sent their best team. The White Squadrons sent their aces. The Tuskegee Airmen sent a team from the 332nd. They flew the P-47 Thunderbolt. They competed in aerial gunnery, dive bombing, and skip bombing. It was the Olympics of fighter pilots. When the smoke cleared and the scores were tallied, the winner was not a White Squadron. It was the 332nd, the Red Tails. They had crushed the competition. They were officially the best shooters in the United States Air Force. But the Air Force buried the results. The trophy was lost. The records were listed as unknown. For 50 years, the history books said the winner of the 1949 competition was a mystery. The Air Force could not admit that the segregated black unit had beaten everyone else. It was not until 1995, after years of research by historians, that the truth was declassified. The trophy was found. The records were corrected. The Tuskegee Airmen were finally recognized as the top guns of 1949. It took 50 years for the truth to catch up to the talent. So when you look at that P-51 Mustang today, do not just see a machine. See the red paint on the tail. That paint is not just decoration. It is the blood of the men who died to put it there. It is the fire of the men who sank destroyers with machine guns. And it is the enduring symbol of the men who proved that the sky belongs to everyone. We rescue these stories to ensure that the 332nd does not disappear into silence. We tell them because the manual said they could not fly. The report said they were cowards. And the society said they were second class. And they answered by being the best damn pilots the world had ever seen. If this story of the Red Tails ignited a fire in you, do me a favor. Smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that history matters. Check your subscription. Make sure you're locked in. We are digging up the legends every week.